Chechen authorities have detained more than 100 gay men, killing at least 3 in the process. That's according to a report published April 1st in Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta. The paper said multiple Chechen government officials had confirmed the disappearances. A spokesman for Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov denied the allegations to Interfax news agency, saying gay people, quote, don't exist in Chechnya. He went on to say even if there were gay people in Chechnya, law enforcement wouldn't have to round them up because, quote, their relatives would send them somewhere from which there's no returning. He was referring to what is known as honor killings, where suspected homosexuals are murdered by their own families. Novaya Gazeta says honor killings are still prevalent in Chechnya. A senior researcher with Human Rights Watch in Moscow told The Independent many of the detained have been beaten up and tortured. For Newsbeat Social, I'm Neela Uni.
According to NBC News, a senior North Korean defector has said that the country's desperate dictator is prepared to use nuclear weapons to strike the United States and its allies. Tae Yong-ho is the most high-profile North Korean defector in 2 decades, meaning he is able to give a rare insight into the secretive authoritarian regime. According to Tae, North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un is desperate in maintaining his rule by relying on his development of nuclear weapons and the ICBM. ICBM is an acronym for Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles, a long-range rocket that in theory would be capable of hitting the U.S.
The Sun didn't get the memo about April Fool's Day because the eruptions it hurled into space starting April 1st were no joke. The flares were followed soon after by a pair of small asteroids making close passes by Earth, all adding up to some lively space weather you probably didn't even notice. 2 medium-sized solar flares were thrown off the same sunspot, one on Saturday and an even bigger one on Sunday. A number of coronal mass ejections, much larger, slower-moving, and shorter explosions of a hot material called plasma, were also thrown off. In addition to these explosions, we also had 2 asteroids buzz by, one closer than the moon and the other just a little further away.
Anti-corruption protests continued across Russia Sunday, days after President Vladimir Putin admitted Russia has a problem with state corruption. The protests hit the capital and several other cities, but attendance was notably smaller than the week before, when Russians took to the streets in droves demanding government reforms to tackle the issue. More than 30 protesters were detained Sunday in central Moscow near Triumphalnaya Square, according to state news agency TASS, an area that's become the usual site of the opposition walk. During the Washington Nationals season opening game Monday in Washington, D.C., protesters brought a banner that said, "Impeach Trump, #resist, revealing it just as the game was ending. The organizers behind the stunt were reportedly from the group Americans Take Action, who also pulled a prank at the Conservative Political Action Conference by distributing small Russian flags with Trump's name. According to one of the group's members, Jason Charter, Americans Take Action was planning on revealing the banner when Trump was on the field to throw the ceremonial first pitch. However, the White House said last week that Trump would not attend the game.
Donald Trump has said the U.S. will have to deal with North Korea on its own if China is unable to. In an exclusive interview with the Financial Times, President Trump said if China helps the U.S. with North Korea, it will be good for them. And if they don't, it won't be good for anyone. He added that he would use trade as an incentive to receive China's cooperation. He also said, quote, if China is not going to solve North Korea, we will, and that it would be possible to solve the problem without China's help. However, President Trump did not elaborate on what steps the U.S. would take to deal with North Korea on its own. In March, U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said all options are on the table when it comes to North Korea, including military engagement. For Newsbeat Social, I'm Matt Paul.
CNET has reported that certain airline passengers flying from the Middle East to Australia face increased scrutiny and potential delays with the introduction of new electronic screening processes. Passengers flying out of Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha will now be randomly selected for explosive detection screening and face additional targeted screening of electronic devices. A number of Middle Eastern and North African travel hubs have been targeted with increased airline security measures in recent weeks. The Australian government has followed the UK example with the introduction of explosives testings in its 3 airports, though it stopped short of issuing a complete ban on the carriage of electronic devices in flight.
China is opposing U.S. deployment of advanced anti-missile radars, which will be through the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System in South Korea. This resistance has become a problem for the U.S. and will most likely be discussed during President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump's upcoming summit meeting. Zhang Baohui, a Hong Kong-based mainland expert on China's nuclear deterrent, said, "It is clear that there is no one in China who really knows the technical capability of THAAD, and that's part of the problem."
If it looks like a race, it's a race to save lives. In their thousands, they're leaving Raqqa. There's a feeling of safety in numbers. They're taking with them what they can as they try to escape the bombing of the international coalition. As the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces get ready for a battle against ISIL in its self-proclaimed capital, locals say that about 200 people have been killed and dozens wounded during airstrikes in the last week. The villages of Al-Mansura, Karatiba, and areas between Tabqa and Raqqa have been targeted. There are no accurate estimates in the number of people trying to get out. What is known is there are no local or international humanitarian organisations there to help. All they can hope for is to meet the kindness of strangers. Many have been left stranded where they have no services, faced with the prospect of leaving behind all they've known or staying to face an uncertain future. Some here are getting out of ISIL-controlled areas that are being bombed and heading to other areas also under the group's control.
Search teams in Colombia were still digging and probing into dense piles of mud and debris Monday. They are refusing to give up the search for survivors of the deadliest flood in recent history of Mocoa, Colombia. The government said the official death toll of the disaster that started 3 days ago had increased to 262. It is likely to rise as the river starts receding and more human remains emerge. Authorities will check any report of movement that could be a sign of life. They are not yet ready to concede that it is too late to find anyone from the list of more than 200 people missing.
A powerful storm system in the southeastern United States that killed 4 people, including a woman swept away by floodwaters while she called 911, put much of the region under a tornado watch on Monday and delayed hundreds of flights. The storm front could dump up to an inch of rain as far north as New England as it rumbles through the Carolinas and the mid-Atlantic states later on Monday with high winds and thunderstorms. A 52-year-old woman driving in the storm's heavy rain died in Florence, Mississippi after her car went into a swollen creek. The woman called 911 as her car went down, but rescuers were unable to reach her in time in the heavily wooded area. Another woman was killed overnight in Tallahatchie County when high winds dropped a tree on her home.
Depression is the #1 cause of ill health and disability worldwide. The World Health Organization estimates that more than 300 million people are living with depression. WHO Director General Dr. Margaret Chan describes these figures as, quote, a wake-up call. To help combat this issue, the WHO has made depression the theme for their 2017 World Health Day, April 7th. They are also running a year-long campaign, Depression, Let's Talk. In their news release on the campaign, they explain why investing in mental health makes economic sense, claiming every $1 invested in depression treatment will bring a $4 return in better health and people going back to work. Depression is already costing the world economy billions and carries a huge human cost in suicide rates. WHO affirms that addressing the prejudice and discrimination issues around depression is their first port of call. For Newsbeat Social, I'm Rachel Latham.
According to Allure.com, acne specialist Joshua Zeichner says the incidence of adult female acne is increasing every year. Zeichner is the Director of Cosmetic and Clinical Research in Dermatology at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, and reportedly there are plans in the works for creating an acne vaccine. In the April issue of Allure magazine, it's been reported that nearly 50 million Americans are diagnosed with acne every year, estimated to be more than the entire population of Australia and Canada. Scientists are unsure of the exact cause, which has contributed to the reason that to date no real cure has been developed.
The Marine Corps could be forced to shut down half of its fighter squadrons this summer if the military branch does not get more funding. Lieutenant General John Davis, Marine Deputy Commandant for Aviation, told lawmakers on March 28th that if Congress does not pass the 2017 Defense Department budget, the Corps would have to shutter 10 fighter squadrons. Davis said that 6 F-18 squadrons and 4 Harrier squadrons would, quote, basically cease flying operations. Congress failed to pass the 2017 Defense Department budget last year, instead passing a continuing resolution that only funded the government through April. Since 2013, the U.S. military has been hit by caps on defense spending, while continuing high rates of deployment and operations. Delays in the delivery of the F-35 strike fighter have also left much of the fleet aging and unreliable. For Newsbeat Social from Washington, D.C., I'm Caitlin Mangum.
This is the Gaza side of the crossing from Israel. It's the final checkpoint, one of 3 needed to be passed to get into Gaza. The journey's all too familiar for Samir Zakut, who works for Al Mazan, a human rights organization based in Gaza. He says he's been harassed many times by the Israelis and is often refused permits to leave.
In my experience, like 2 years ago, right now, I applied more than 20 times for the Israeli permits, but all the time they reject or delaying or denying my application.
It's not just human rights workers. The Israelis control everyone entering Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. Human rights lawyers say very little can be done to combat Israeli control.
What can be done is limited given Israeli law. There is no law to regulate entry. Israel controls access based on changing regulations, depending on what they claim to be security needs.
The strategy goes back to the 1967 war. The Israelis can impose restrictions on access because the Palestinian territory is under occupation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, while under siege in Gaza. Various agreements between the Israelis and the Palestinians have tried to address right of access issues. However, things have just got harder for the Palestinians. The Israelis won't allow them to open a seaport, an airport, or any other kind of border crossing that the Palestinian Authority could control. The HRW report also criticizes Hamas for not complying with international investigations, and it's critical of the Israeli army, which it says relies on human rights groups to provide it with information on human rights abuses that may have occurred during the 2014 Gaza war. Israel's coordinator of government activities in the territories is dismissing the allegations.
Japanese whaling ships have returned to port after killing 333 minke whales. A ceremony marked the whalers' arrival March 31st at Shimonoseki Port, but critics around the globe are condemning the harvest, not celebrating it. Kitty Block, vice president of Humane Society International, calls it a, quote, obscene cruelty that must end. This is an annual expedition for Japanese whalers, though. They reported an identical count of 333 whales upon returning from a similar journey last year. The number 333 represents the annual average of Japan's goal of killing 4,000 whales over 12 years as part of its research program. Japan temporarily halted whale hunts following a 2014 international court ruling that ordered the country to immediately stop whaling operations.
In a world first, stem cells were transplanted from one human to another. The procedure took place March 28th in Japan. Doctors took skin cells from a donor and basically reprogrammed them into something called induced pluripotent stem cells. This means the cells were put back into their embryonic state. From there, they were coaxed to grow into retinal cells. The cells were then transplanted into the retina of a 60-year-old man with age-related macular degeneration. His condition would typically lead to blindness, but doctors hope the cell transplant will prevent that from happening. The procedure could mark an important turning point because the stem cells were taken from a mature adult donor and then reprogrammed back into an embryonic state. This sidesteps the ethical dilemma of taking stem cells from human embryos.
A federal judge ruled that a lawsuit claiming President Donald Trump incited violence at a campaign rally can proceed. In a 22-page ruling released March 31st, U.S. District Court Judge David Hale said 3 anti-Trump protesters had established enough evidence to proceed with their case. The incident in question occurred during a campaign rally in Kentucky in March 2016, when then-candidate Trump yelled, quote, "Get him out of here," in reference to protesters in the crowd. The plaintiffs claimed that they were subsequently shoved and punched by Trump supporters. Hale, in his ruling, said that it was plausible that Trump's direction to get him out of here advocated the use of force. Lawyers for Trump and his campaign have argued that Trump was using free speech and was not instructing the crowd to use force. The plaintiffs are seeking unspecified monetary damages. For Newsbeat Social from Washington, D.C., I'm Caitlin Mangum.
Ecuador's leftist candidate has won the country's presidential elections after a close race. The National Electoral Council said April 3rd, Lenin Moreno won just over 51% of the vote, with 99% of the votes counted. Moreno beat conservative candidate Guillermo Lasso. Both Bolivian President Evo Morales and Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, left-wing leaders in their respective countries, congratulated Moreno on Twitter. Maduro's rule in Venezuela has been criticized recently by members of the international community as increasingly totalitarian. Candidate Lasso disputed the results and demanded a recount. The election results may affect WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Assange is taking refuge in the country's London embassy and fighting extradition to Sweden. Lasso said he would remove Assange from the embassy in London. Moreno is expected to allow Assange to stay. For Newsbeat Social, I'm Kimberly Caldwell.
After a massive mudslide in Colombia killed 240, search and rescue teams combed through the debris and helped people who'd been clawing at huge mounds of mud by hand. Many had little of their former lives left to search through. The deluge smashed houses, tore trees out by the roots, and washed cars and trucks away. Mocoa is vulnerable to flooding. It's surrounded by 3 rivers and a natural basin created by the surrounding mountains. The danger has grown worse in recent years because of deforestation, which eliminates some protection from runoff, and because many people built their homes close to the water.
Protesters set Paraguay's legislative building on fire after senators voted to remove presidential term limits. Senators voted March 31st to approve a bill that would overturn the current law limiting Paraguayan presidents to 1 5-year term. Opposition leaders called the vote a coup and encouraged Paraguayans to resist. Protesters set fire to the building and ransacked offices and hallways inside. Police and protesters clashed both in the building and in the streets. One protester named Rodrigo Quintana was shot and killed. Many called for an investigation into his death. The law prohibiting re-election was created in 1992 after Paraguay was ruled for 35 years by dictator Alfredo Stroessner. The proposed bill would amend Paraguay's constitution and allow President Horacio Cartes to run for a second term. It would also allow former presidents to run for additional terms. The proposed bill must be approved in the House before it becomes law. For Newsbeat Social, I'm Kimberly Caldwell.
With the stakes on the Korean Peninsula as high as they ever have been, life for the men and women with the U.S. Air Force's 51st Fighter Wing is lived in a state of constant alert. South Korea has no nuclear weapons, so it relies on the United States nuclear umbrella to deter North Korea and its erratic leader, Kim Jong-un. Osan in South Korea is less than 50 miles from the demilitarized zone that separates the mortal enemies and is home to a large portion of nearly 30,000 U.S. military personnel in South Korea, making it the leading edge of the shield that protects the South from the North. Un is desperate and is prepared to use nuclear weapons to strike the United States and its allies, which means that at any moment, the men and women of Osan could have to drop everything, grab their gear, and go into battle.
4 people were killed in storms across the South over the weekend, including a Mississippi woman who desperately tried to direct rescuers to her sinking vehicle after it skidded into a rain-swollen creek. Jacqueline Williams, 52, ran off a road into a creek in Florence before dawn Monday and dialed 911 from the car as it went down. She was trying to tell the dispatcher her location, but the swirling current was too strong and fast. Williams and the dispatcher lost contact as sirens could be heard in the background of the call. A swiftwater recovery team later found Williams' body in the creek outside the car.
Facebook, Mozilla, and Craigslist founder Craig Newmark are part of a consortium of tech leaders, academics, and nonprofits committing $14 million into the creation of the News Integrity Initiative. The consortium was jointly announced on Monday. The SUNY Graduate School of Journalism will administer the initiative. The school will spearhead new literacy and aim to increase trust in journalism around the world. During last year's U.S. presidential election, the issue of fake news was highlighted as being a significant problem. Facebook's platform in particular was called out for allowing people to easily spread false news stories.